So I had this idea for like a modern workbench build with tons of nifty and cool tech. And this is one of those projects where you kind of have that vision for what it's going to be. So it's already like built in your head. And basically you start running around like a squirrel trying to collect all the things you need to put it together. So this one involves this Google Home as a form of placeholder, lots of fun chemicals like this varnish and some wood glue, this brand being the cheapest I could find. Metal hardware to hold some of these desk legs in place, these being the FlexiSpot E7s. In prior builds I used the E5s, but there's one slight difference that may be worth the extra money. So we'll also be 3D printing some of these parts that hold the sit-stand legs in place, and it's going to be another one of those folding setups like the others. Wasn't able to get the same casters as those though, so these are a little larger, but I think they'll do just fine. This time we'll also be integrating some of these power plugs with 3D printed components. Not entirely sure how we're going to do that, but I'm sure we'll figure it out.
How about incorporating wireless charging pads into the workbench surface for charging your devices while you work? It's convenient and keeps your workspace clutter-free.
Starting off with cutting these 50 by 50mm beams to size. These will become the sides of the top itself, which will allow all the cables to run through the body of the build, alongside recessing all the tech and the motors. And it's very similar to my others, but with some slight differences and upgrades. Now, what we're building is something I hope to be upgrading in the near future. So if you're into the tech space, you'll probably be using AI, integrating it into your work, or perhaps in some way, shape or form, it's finding its way into your life. That Google Home is then a form of placeholder. I would like to upgrade it in the near future to a form of ChatGPT integration, which somewhat brings into question, why would you want that in a workbench? Actually, I'd like this workbench to be completely device free, so to say. I want it to be something that I work behind and then completely forget that my phone exists, because I don't want to be distracted by the notifications of those devices anymore. I think it kind of stems from my past or like my upbringing. I used to watch a lot of Star Trek movies, and I was always really intrigued by this sort of like a character in the film, which is basically the computer.
You might want to consider integrating a built-in digital assistant or voice-controlled system directly into the workbench.
Fast forward to today, we actually have that computer character. We have ChatGPT and we can have conversations with it, which are actually useful. That is exactly the conclusion I came to. I'm really curious, how did you come up with that? Yeah, it somewhat hasn't found its way into Google Home devices like this, which somewhat bugs me. I think that would be like the first integration people would like. And I think that has to do with sometimes it has weird responses or it lies or that kind of stuff.
Well, I gathered from your desire to minimize distraction that having a built-in digital assistant would allow you to access information and control tasks without needing to reach for your phone. It's all about understanding your needs and finding a solution that fits.
But the dream here is that we are building a baseline today, and then hopefully someday, it has like this ecosystem with security cameras and that kind of stuff, and then you can ask it like,
hey, where did I leave my screwdriver? And the AI system could analyze the camera feed to identify the screwdriver's location and provide you with the information.
Just a quick reminder that if you enjoyed the video at any point, just leave a like or leave a comment. And even a dislike or critique helps, because then I can assess like what I need to improve upon with these videos. So definitely let me know.
Keep me updated on your progress.
You don't sound too convinced there, ChatGPT. What's going on? Which brings us into the 3D printing aspect of this whole build process. There's two main things that I'd like to take care of in advance. That being the motor mounts, which will allow the E7 legs to be recessed into the desktop itself. I'm pretty clear on this because that's how I built the other two setups as well, and it looks amazing. There's a slight difference in this one though, because the E7 legs have that column section close to the motors instead of at the bottom, which will allow that bottom piece to fit snugly around it, and that's also why I went for the E7 legs. The only issue here is that I don't actually have the E7 legs on hand, so I'm kind of measuring the E5 legs in the hopes that it will be similar. Usually it's not really a problem, but I'm sending these printed parts off to the sponsor for today's video, PCBWay, so this could go horribly wrong. I'm playing with the sponsor's money. With those out of the way, I quickly modeled out the last piece, which is the Google Home insert, and it's very similar to the one I had on the desk setup, so I'm basically taking that file and adjusting it a little bit. But I still have some other stuff that I still need to model and print, like the mounts for the power plugs, which will also be integrated into the desktop, and I'll do this on my own printer. So with that out of the way, we'll first continue with gluing these beams we cut the size earlier to the sheet of Multiplex. I'm using an excessive amount of glue here, as that makes the final build quite beautiful. It just fills up all of those gaps you would normally have. and when we sand it down later it becomes really nice and flush with everything. Now earlier on I decided to go for some 45-degree cuts on the beam, so to say, and normally on these builds I don't do that, I just make right angle cuts, and this did bring me into some trouble because I couldn't really get that to be flush with each other, and I used some of these massive glue clamps. In the end you also had to use the ratchet strap method to apply pressure from the other side, so all the corners are kind of compressed in at each other. After all that we can let it dry out throughout the day and come back a little while later to put on that final multiplex sheet. I always first double check to see which side looks best, so I'm test fitting the panel here, and this is quite important. There might be some damage on the panel, or maybe that grain doesn't look as good as you want it to. The thing you should definitely look out for is if they sanded it down too much in the factory, that wood glue layer might expose, and when you paint it with some kind of lacquer or polyurethane, it really starts to pop, and that colour is not really that nice to look at. So alright, so this is the design that I came up with. Here we have a top plate, which will be screwed into the wood through these gaps. And these little holes are for M3 bolts, which will be screwed into this bottom section. And this holds the power plug. That's around this time where my 3D printer was just like completely destroying itself. I'm not entirely sure why this keeps happening, but there's just goo everywhere. So I cleaned it out, put it back together, and I got one print off, but that was just about all it was able to do. Right, so the printer died again. This time it went a little haywire, went straight into the bed, and during the print it actually just ruined it by going too deep, so I'd say, and then it was knocking into this. So as I'm making more and more videos about building stuff on this channel, I thought it would be prudent to invest in a new one, which didn't arrive until far later down the line, so that's why this video took so long. Now I made two of these wooden boxes, so to say, so let me know in the comments if you noticed that I mixed and matched the footage. It was shot on two completely different days, so that made the edit quite fun. I took these to my parents' house where we can sand it down with a belt sander. This is just to take off that millimeter of overhang, which results in a very clean finish but keeps true to the size. Now when I got home I made sure to sand down the corners to give it a nice round over, and this is just so that the wood doesn't start splintering over time. And this is also a great time to take care of any imperfections in the wood. Now you can't sand down the multiplex too much because it will expose that glue layer, but just to soften it up and take care of any minor things. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some of the 3D printed parts I handed off to the sponsor of today's video, which is PCBWay. You can simply upload the files, choose the quantity and what type of material you'd like to print it in, so you get an instant quote for what it's going to cost. But of course they also offer other services like PCB production and assembly, sheet metal fabrication, CNC machining, injection molding, and all of this at quite affordable prices. When those parts arrived a few days later, I was quite shocked at how awesome the quality was. I've never seen printed parts that good before come out of my machine, so I left a link in the description down below. Definitely check them out. Alright, after receiving those parts we can mark out where to place those legs. Now I'm personally a big fan of practical marking, so actually holding that piece in place and then just scribbling around it with a pencil. So that also results in a little bit of an excess, and that ensures that it's not too tight of a fit. After marking out all those sections, we can drill a hole in the center of each, and if you're interested in how I captured the shots for this video, I have some other videos on my channel where I go through all the unique gear that I put together, and that's where I find a lot of the joy in creating these videos as well, like finding new cinematic ways to capture the shots, and I hope it's entertaining. With those holes we can make a quick jigsaw run, so I like to go in a flower pattern, starting each cut in the center and then ending each cut in the corner as well, and that results in a very clean straight cut. I've tried going all the way around in the past and it's never really worked, even though that's what we're doing with the goodbye insert here. This jigsaw also continuously throws dust in my face when I look down at the blade, so it's quite frustrating to work with this one. Now after each cut I'll also test fit the 3D printed insert to see if it fits, and In most cases here it fits just fine with a little bit of room to wiggle, but if it doesn't fit for some reason, you can always just go past it again with the jigsaw and take off a small edge. Now, one of the problems with going for the E7 legs over the E5s is that the control box for those sit-stand legs is far larger, so it didn't quite fit in the build at first, but luckily I was taking it apart and then I realized I could just shove it in there and then put it back together within the build, which is going to be an absolute pain if something breaks, because that's going to be a total hassle trying to get that out again. Now, we also need to add a power strip to feed all the other plugs that were inside this thing, which couldn't be taken apart, so I basically just brute forced it in there, and I'm not sure if that one is ever coming out again. After that, we'll have to test fit the legs themselves. So there's two ways that these things are connected to the desk itself. One is through the 3D printed components, and those are basically pancaked on top of each other, and we have these M3 bolts which will go through it and hold the bottom 3D printed piece to the top 3D printed piece. Usually I'd add a nut to this as well, but because this is just a test bit, we don't have to do that. We're going to have to take it apart later anyway to paint the desk with some lacquer. The other method for holding this stuff in place is the M6 bolt, which will go through the mounting points on the desk legs themselves and through the 3D printed inserts and the wood. Now, usually I'd add a bolt to this as well, which isn't entirely possible, so basically I'm hoping that it will thread into the wood very nicely and keep it secured that way. While we're driving these in, you can see that the motors start to become flush with the 3D printed parts and the desk. And of course doing the same on the other side here. Now, another thing that surprises me is that these legs don't have a Smarthome integration. It would be really cool if we could just tell our voice assistant, like, hey, raise the legs up to this specific height, or perhaps say, keep me active throughout the day. And when you've been sitting for too long working away, you don't really notice that you haven't been standing, so that they automatically raise the desk. And I think this could be a really plug and play solution. It has an Ethernet port on the control box, which could be an upgrade that comes out in the future. After we have all those in the correct spot, we can add the bottom piece, which is now upside down, so it's at the top. But this is just so we can accurately measure where those legs will be placed. As I mentioned before, I prefer practical measuring instead of theoretical measuring, as there might be some slight deviations in the build. So measuring how far the sides are from the legs, and when it's in the correct spot, marking a small rectangle so we know where to create that gap for the legs to be recessed into. And then again marking it out with the 3D printed insert in place. Now, the reason I'm recessing these into the desktop is so it makes the maximum height quite low, and this allows it to fit inside of a passenger car. And I measured up my parents' car. I don't personally have one, but it would be nice to someday be able to transport this easily to a different location without taking it apart. But the biggest factor here is that it improves the rigidity, because it has 2 points of contact, that bottom section, and then also the contact with the 3D printed insert and the top panels, I'd say. And that's quite essential for a workbench, so it doesn't wobble all over the place. And again here, a quick jigsaw run in that flower pattern. These can be a little bigger and allow for some more wiggle, as those inserts will be screwed down into the top plate once those legs are in place. Now, it's quite funny actually, a couple months ago I was somewhat conflicted about what I wanted to do in life, and pretty quickly I came to the conclusion that as long as I'm building things, I'll be happy. So I was conceptualizing this build-only channel where I'd film very cinematic things where I'm just making stuff. And I'm quite happy that, we're already heading towards that goal. And of course I hope to upgrade the quality a little bit in the future by getting a bit of a larger space, because at the moment I'm living in my apartment and it's getting quite crowded. There's all kinds of lights and acoustic panels all over the place. And when people come past, they're also really shocked. They're like, what is all this stuff, and why is your kitchen not accessible anymore, and your bedroom is like a storage unit? I live kind of like a maniac, to be honest.
If your kitchen has become so cluttered that it's inaccessible and difficult to use, then it's likely not meeting your needs effectively.
The only thing we need to do now is mark out where those holes are going to be placed to mount the bottom section to the legs. And usually I just lower the legs down, see where they land, and then do the whole measuring trick again, and then go around it with a pencil. In this case, that's not entirely possible because that gap is too small to go around it with a pencil. And so Here we're just using a piece of paper, creating a form of template of what that bottom looks like, and then flipping over that entire piece, lowering the legs down, and again doing the whole measuring thing, checking from each side, seeing if it's in the center, and then using that piece as a little template to see where we need to drill those holes. And of course also double checking those measurements, because if we get this in the wrong spot, then that entire bottom piece is basically ruined. Now in this case it's also handy to use a drill that is a bit larger than the bolt that we'll be feeding through this. It just allows for a little bit of wiggle room when we start mounting this stuff, and when it's the exact same size as the bolt you'll never get them in the right spot. That metal hardware I showed in the beginning of the video comes into play here. I noticed on prior builds that the wood is a little too flexible for those sit-stand legs to be mounted directly to it, and it resulted in a lot of sway, especially when you have that leverage on it when you push it about. So this is really quick, easy and cheap. You could go for something far more rugged, which is like an entirely custom made build plate, so to say, and mount that in there, but that was a little too much work for me. These things work perfectly for now. Yeah, I'm fairly sure that this is going to be just fine. So after the test fit, everything had to be taken apart again. I'm skipping this because it's quite boring and you get the idea. Now, I'm not the most patient person, so this video I also just wanted to build, film and edit it within like a week, which would have worked if that stupid printer hadn't broken down. But this next thing then is pure agony for me. I made some DIY wood filler and went around the build making sure to get rid of any small gaps that were in the wood. In the end, it's quite a therapeutic process, but also somewhat boring and usually something I'd skip, but I started to see how nice this thing was coming together, and I thought it'd be a shame if we, didn't do this and look back at it and think like, that's a pity. I would have preferred not to add any kind of lacquer coating because this will inevitably alter the colour, might darken it over time, but it's going to undergo quite a lot of wear and tear over its lifespan, so if inevitably a cup of water or coffee spills over this thing, it's not going to leave a stain, and it's pretty easy to clean it up. So first I'm cleaning up the surface with a damp cloth before we do the paint job, even though inevitably there will be something stuck in that thing. Like, it's the law of the universe. When you're like painting something, it sees that, it's like, ooh, let's send a fly out there to just mess that up. I've never had a paint job go perfectly before. Now, as somebody who doesn't have any patience, light coats is also something I've never really been too good at, so usually I just dump an entire jar on there and then spread it out over the thing, which has worked out okay, but I mean my entire apartment is then toxic for a couple of days. And painting is one of those meditative things. I really enjoy doing it. I can imagine if you do it every day then it becomes less interesting, but just that mesmerizing sound and then the changing colour of the wood really puts my brain to sleep without actually sleeping. So it feels a lot more relaxing than actually sleeping, because that feels like this is like a circus going on in my head or something. Whereas this is just, pure calm seas ahead. It's like, it's the best thing ever. After a little while, the new 3D printer also arrived. This is the Creality K1C. They released it about 3 months ago, and a new model is coming out pretty soon. It amazes me that these things can now be shipped fully assembled without actually breaking down. And initially I was looking at the Bamboo Lab P1P, but that one is a little bit outside of my price range. I'm hoping that this one doesn't give as much trouble as the Ender 3 did. Now, setup was pretty easy. I got the printing in about half an hour. I'm actually really shocked at how fast this thing was going. I thought that all the footage online was like sped up, but it is literally just zooming around like nobody's business. It has a little camera in there which records very low resolution time-lapse images, but it does it automatically, so that's cool. And the printing speeds on this thing are also quite improved, so I was able to get back to work shortly after receiving this thing. Next we'll mark out where to make the holes for the power plugs, so I'm making sure that it's 6 centimeters inwards from each side, and hoping that all the edges are relatively flat and straight. In the end though, I'm fairly sure you won't notice any of the slight deviations. I'm using the printer here to draw it all up again, and there's 4 of these things on each side, nice and out of sight, yet still easily accessible, so I'm hoping that these things keep cables and stuff safe without actually having the power plugs on the floor, so to say. And again, during the jigsaw run, test fitting all the pieces to see if it all works out and fits into place. Now it might also be nice to add some access holes between the motor mounts and the power plugs, so you can easily add those bolts that I was talking about earlier. But that would also mean that we can't utilize that space anymore for something different if something pops up in the future. After that, we're screwing in the power plugs with these M3 bolts, and I'm not using the nuts in this case because it is quite difficult to get in there and I wasn't quite expecting this, so I might have done better to buy like a bigger printer with a larger print bed because it was already at its limit of its print capacity. If I made it a little larger, it would have been a little easier. Now there is also this concern about replacement plugs because I bought these in a store that doesn't really restock them. And so if one of these ever breaks, then I'll probably have to replace all 4 of them because I can't buy them again. Not entirely sure what could go wrong with them, but I have somewhat of a bad feeling about this for some reason. Now before buying these plugs, I was also looking on Amazon for some off-the-shelf solutions, which there are some of them, but they're quite expensive. So these were like 30 euros, whereas the plugs I bought were 3 euros a pop, and then adding those 3D printed parts maybe brings it up to 5 euros. So it's quite cool to see that this 3D printing stuff is really saving me money as well. And I can't wait for some advancements to come out in the space where we also have commercial grade printers being able to print in metals or some kind of mini concrete. Would be quite fun. Now we also need a place for the motor cables to go into the desk and the main power cable to exit the desk. So I drilled some holes in this thing, which were just large enough to accommodate a European sized plug. And here we're also screwing down those power plugs into the wood. I'm using these black screws, which I'm not entirely sure if those are meant for wood, but I like the aesthetic overall. I then modelled out some of these inserts to clean up the look of the cable holes, and these printed in about half an hour, which is quite insane. It's gotten to the point where it's just like a household appliance, to be honest. Now usually I wouldn't really bother filling this up, but the level of detail I'll go through for this YouTube thing is actually really quite amazing. I primarily use it to achieve the goals I set out for myself, which sounds kind of crazy, but it's just that dopamine kick to get you to places. And it's kind of like a life hack. I see a lot of YouTubers talk about how input doesn't actually equal output in many instances, which is absolutely true. I have no clue why some videos do well and some don't. And I mean, I have ideas about it. Like, I filmed this video in a very over-the-shoulder method and try to write the story as if you're here just chilling alongside me. And I'm often also talking in the sense of we instead of the I. And this is all just to, you know, make you also be engaged in it because you're just as much experienced in this as I am. And I also use like tricks like the split screen, where if you get bored from this scene, you subconsciously switch to the other one instead of clicking away from the video, balancing character, storylines and retention, and trying to do that at a quality I enjoy. Does it work? I have no clue. It might just get 10 views, and sometimes I really feel like YouTube only recommends bad videos. Like I have a video and I'm like, oh, that's trash. And all of a sudden it gets thousands upon thousands of views. It's also the only thing I really enjoy doing. I've never had something where the return on investment is so low, yet I keep striving forward in that segment. And I think that's also because this is completely mine. I wrote the script, I filmed the video, I put in the effort, I built this thing. But the nice thing about also making content about building stuff is at the end of it, if I do get 10 views, well, at least now I have a workbench, which I finished in half the time I would if I didn't make these YouTube videos, because I'd be unmotivated. I think the moral of the story here is use your addictions for good. I added all the metal hardware to the desk and lowered it down with the 3D printed inserts in place, and hopefully this will be the last time that we see it disconnected from each other. Yeah, great idea, Justin. Just put your head underneath this thing that can topple over at any moment. I need like a life insurance sponsor. After all this, we can flip the desk over without the risk of the metal hardware falling out of place. Didn't hear any rattling, so I'm assuming that everything is fine in there. and I went past with a drill just to double check everything and tighten it down a little extra. Then I went past with a ruler and marked out where to place the casters, so they're all 1 centimeter inwards from the sides, and then held the caster in place, marked where I should pre-drill the holes because these screws for the casters are quite big, so it would be an absolute shame if we screwed them in and the wood would crack on something. And I waited to put in these last screws until the desk was upright and in its resting position, as this could go wrong if you leave it lying on its side and it's kind of crooked, then it will be crooked even when it's standing up. So now I'm really grateful for sponsors like PCBWay, who also provided the 3D printed parts and enabled me to create more videos like this one. Alright, so here we have it. I'd like to upgrade this cable to like a black one pretty soon, but maybe also add one of those power banks which has like 2000 watts of output and hang that underneath it so that we can also take it outside and work with our power tools out there. But mostly also so that we don't have to attach it to anything in the wall over here, and we can just adjust the height freely without having to plug it in. In terms of that height adjustability, it's pretty stable. It's more stable than the other setups I had, and that's mostly due to, you know, that extra point of contact. Of course, this entire bottom section over here is really handy if you just want to store some tools and still want to be able to move the desk about with everything staying in place, so to say. Goes up to a pretty decent height as well. This is the maximum. Then you can just lower it down to whatever you're comfortable with. So I think it's definitely a success. If you enjoyed this video, I'm linking to one of Cam's videos. I don't personally know Cam, but I really enjoy watching his content, so I'm sure you will too. And hopefully see you in the next one.